I encourage you to toss subtle right out the window. Start carving up and processing those vocals in a big way. Well, am I ever excited for today's session? Totally inspired by a recent comment and question left by Matthew. Thank you so much for engaging on the channel, Matthew. I appreciate it big time. I'm going to go ahead and share part of your comment and question verbatim because I think it's awesome. What Matthew's talking about is finding the vocal level sweet spot in his mixes. And he goes on to share, I find difficulty pushing the vocals in front of the instruments. Often, I find the vocals too loud in my mixes. And when I make adjustments using EQ and compression, I feel I get into a muddy mess. Perhaps it's my ears. I try not to follow the norms when I produce, but I think I'm questioning if there is a norm. Should vocals find themselves in front of the rest of the tracks? Oh man, this is an excellent question, Matthew, and honestly, one that isn't necessarily that easy to answer straight up. I mean, if we're talking about popular music on the radio, yes, those vocals have to be pushed way out front, as evidenced by everything that we hear on the radio today. But that kind of approach definitely doesn't translate to all genres. I mean, most of my career, I've spent working on really aggressive industrial electronic music and metal, a lot of music that has never had a designation for the radio. So why should I be following the rules of radio when the product that I'm producing isn't even destined for radio? Yeah, Matthew, I can relate to your question in a big way. This is an area that I used to struggle with, always questioning and sort of second guessing if I had enough vocal in that mix. And so for today's session, I want to share a couple of simple techniques that I get up to in helping me put that vocal on top of my mix without necessarily pushing the fader up. And for this example, we don't have to look any further than our recent collab remix project, the ohGr Lockdown Mix. It's a great example of exactly the sort of thing that I get up to every day when I'm producing. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this track, let's just go back to maybe 8 bars before the first verse, just for a little perspective. Check it. Great example of a vocal cutting right through that mix without actually being that loud in the mix. And of course, you can hear clearly that I'm being very aggressive with the processing of that vocal sound to achieve that. And this is where I can just totally relate to what Matthew is saying, because back in the day, I was always trying to be subtle about everything that I did as an engineer mixer. And I would just sit there and ultimately force everything into that mix with little subtle moves, only to find that at the end of the day, I would just destroy the whole mix because I wasn't getting aggressive. And I've talked about this recently. If we're working on pop music, industrial electronic music, something like this ohGr remix, toss subtle right out the window. You've absolutely got to start getting aggressive. And that's exactly what I did with this vocal sound, to have it sit on top of the mix without killing the rest of my mix. You know, I've carved this vocal sound and literally piped it into my mix in exactly the frequency range that I want it to show up. And this is the kind of stuff that I get up to all the time. And I strongly encourage us, don't be afraid to get aggressive with those EQs and compressors. And I shared a recent session called How to Make Sounds Pop in Your Mix. And a lot of that content relates directly to vocals. This is a great example. I went back to this original session that came from Mark and ohGr, and I found the original vocal line. Let's have a listen to the unprocessed vocal the way it came from Mark and ohGr. Just gotta make that active, and I'll solo this up, and let's have a listen.
Everything disastrous is pure.
Here's how I ended up processing that vocal sound.
Everything disastrous is pure.
Yeah, that's not a subtle amount of EQ that I'm adding to that track. Well, just for the exercise, let's have a listen to the original unprocessed lead vocal in place of what I came up with. Check it.
Everything disastrous is pure.
Yeah, perfect example where I'm literally forced to keep pushing that unprocessed vocal in order to have it sit on top of my mix. And of course, because it's full range, it starts taking out your whole mix, right? This is where I strongly encourage you to start getting aggressive. Start thinking about that vocal and exactly where you want it in that mix. There's no rule book. One concept that I've really been sort of pushing lately is the idea that there's no rule book in this business, okay? One of the most important things about what I get up to when I mix, introducing the vocal earlier than later. This is such a huge mistake that I made earlier on in my career where I wouldn't introduce that lead vocal until like halfway or better into my mix. Yeah, that was crazy. It's so important to introduce the vocal early into your mix. It'll absolutely be a game changer in how your mixes come across in the end. Now, another thing that can make or break your mixes as far as that vocal's concerned is the stereo image. This is so important. If I'm mixing a really lush, wide song, the last thing I'm going to want to do is introduce a bunch of lush, wide vocals to that. When I'm creating vocal effects, I pay very close attention to what's going on in the stereo image. In the next section of this song, I've added a really simple slapback echo with my PCM42. That is a mono delay, and this is one of the reasons that I end up using a lot of mono effects is because I love that delay. And I use it often as either a slap echo or more of a kind of reverb or a longer delay. But what's common about that delay is that every time I'm using it, it's in mono. Mono is your friend. I know that there are a billion stereo effects and, stereo effects are lovely, but mono is your friend when it comes to mixing, particularly when you're sorting out all this vocal business. This is a perfect example where when this delay kicks in, it's just coming straight up the middle. Check it.
Contemplation over this. Everything disastrous is true.
And with the same delay in the next section, I add more of a long kind of reverby sound. But both of them are mono and both of them are very effective. Check it.
When I found blue.
Yeah, there's no doubt that the stereo image plays a huge role in creating a really good vocal balance. And I promise you, mono is your friend. Well, thank you very much for sitting in on today's session. And as far as vocals are concerned, I encourage you to toss subtle right out the window. Start carving up and processing those vocals in a big way. And listen to what happens to your productions. Bye.